Well, now, I was a child of the 60s. I started high school in 1960. And of course, things like civil rights actions were going on by the time that 1960 rolled around, and people were actually, in Vietnam. Americans were actually in Vietnam at that time. There was no one thing, I think, that got me going, except being aware of what was on TV, reading the newspaper, and I was also into. I got into the beat poets even before high school, and reading them and reading the things they referred to got me into the larger scene of American literature, particularly from the writers from the 20s and the 30s, which were a lot of the leftist protester writers, John Dos Passos and those kind of things. So by the time I got into high school, I was sort of primed to get into this. Well, then 1960, going up, I graduated in 64. Those were really heady years, and you couldn't avoid what was going on in the world. So if there's anything that inspired me, it was the world around me. And that's what it was. And of course, I was aware of Dr. Martin Luther King. I was aware of all the other figures at the time, Malcolm X, all of that. And my own personal politics began turning more and more left while I was there in high school, and reading, talking to other people. I remember having a conversation with one of my high school friends. At that time, the monks in Vietnam were immolating themselves, and we had this big discussion as to what that meant and how you could do that and everything. And that was the first time I think I remember really getting into the politics, but also what individual people were doing and could do. So then after that, I went to New York City to go to college. I went to Fordham. I was there for 2 years. I started there in 64. I was there 64 to 66. Those were wild years, what was going on. I got involved. I didn't know too much about Vietnam by the time I got to Fordham, but as soon as I got there, I learned a lot about it from a handful of people, really, who were involved with it. There was ROTC on the campus, and there was one guy that had been protesting it for years. He was an upperclassman. And that sort of got me interested. Why is he doing this? What's going on? And then some of the upperclassmen explained to me things about Vietnam, the history of Vietnam, and what was going on. So I'm getting this from essentially my contemporaries and from the newspapers, not from any classes I was taking. I decided I sort of just got into the flow. And one of the first, maybe the first demonstration I was at was that there was at Fordham is a Jesuit university, and they had what they call the provincial house, where the high mucky mucks of the Jesuits lived and things like that. And there was a priest who, I don't remember where he was, but he was protesting the Vietnam War and speaking out a lot on it. And I didn't know who it was at the time. Now, as I look back, I realize it was Daniel Berrigan. But I didn't know at the time. And so they wanted to have a demonstration in front of the provincial house with a petition to go to these Jesuits to have them not, he was going to be exiled. Of course, he was exiled to Central America, so he got really radicalized there. But at the time, we didn't think it was, he was speaking out against the war and they shouldn't exile him. So, being a new kid on the block, I volunteered to take the petition up to the door and hand it to them. And I knocked on the door, and this ancient Jesuit came to the door, and I said whatever I said to him and handed petitions, and that was it. But that was sort of my first foray into all of that. And then, as far as the civil rights movement things going on, then I remember going to some kind of demonstration in Albany at the Capitol. I think high school. Pretty sure it was high school. And it may have been, I haven't checked the dates, may have been after the murder of Medgar Evers. And, saw a great load of community people out there. And I don't remember, that was the first time I saw the brothers. and Leon Van Dyke and those folks. And it may have been later on when I came back to Albany. But at Fordham, we had a big debate as to which civil rights organization we were going to join. And Fordham at that time was mostly men. Their women were having there for the first time the year I came to Fordham in '64, but most of the people were men. The debate was between SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and it went with CORE. So I remember being in those debates, not really debating, but listening to people and deciding all this. And then I remember being in a march in Harlem with the Fordham contingent of CORE, walking through the streets of Harlem in some big civil rights demonstration. And people coming out of their windows and waving to us and everything. I thought, oh, this is great. I really got charged up on that. So that was my years at Fordham. I ran out of money, came back to Albany, and went to SUNY, where I could actually pay my way by working full-time in the summer and part-time throughout the year. And college was really affordable. And there was an SDS chapter, so I joined that. In fact, the two people who ran that SDS chapter live in Albany, so I may put you in touch with them if you want to. So I joined SDS and a lot of demonstrations. There was the whole student power thing was going on. They were trying to get a African American Studies program going, which they did, of course. So it was a lot of things happening, and there were professors there that supported the students, and many that didn't. But the ones I remember, like Harry Staley, who's gone now, but he lived in Albany. Sylvia Barnard still lives in Albany, and she was one of those that was with the students and everything. So it was a powerful time. And then I finished school in January of '69 and realized I was going to get drafted. And so I took the summer off. Well, the summer off, I was working. I didn't take. I worked from January into about June. Stayed in touch with my draft board. Nice guy, legal and all that. Then I traveled across the country in 1969 with my friend with a tent trailer on the back of a car and all that stuff. And wrote to my draft board and said I was traveling during the summer. I would be back in September. I got back in September, went back to working in the luncheonette in Del Mar. That's how I paid my way through college. And got my draft notice. My mother worked in the post office, as a matter of fact. She was a clerk in the post office. And she came down and handed me the letter while I was at work. So my physical, I had the physical. And then I eventually went in December, early December of 1969. A classic scene. I lived in Del Mar, and I had just gotten married to my girlfriend. We decided, just get married now, we'll get the extra money from the government for the allotment and all that. And it was that scene. A cab picked me up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my mother and my wife in their housecoats on the front porch, crying and waving goodbye. So I'm drafted. Now, at that time, when you were drafted, your term of service was 2 years. So I knew I had an ending point that I could look forward to if I wanted to get there. And I just figured I'm going to go in, I'm going to do whatever I have to, and get out. Did basic training at Fort Dix. Then I was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky, to be trained as a radio operator. And basically I was trained as a radio operator by learning Morse code, which they didn't really use, but I don't know why they did it. But it was great because it was like going to school. So weekends were free. So I go to basically class every day, learning da-da-da, and radio procedures and how to put up big antennas and all that stuff. And then almost all the way through, I was scoring pretty high on the code. and they were sending me down to Fort Gordon, Georgia, I think that is, to be a teletype operator. So, got my bags packed. I'm standing at the base's bus stop to be taken to get a plane, and the sergeant comes up to me and says, "I don't have your orders." I said, "I don't know. I had nothing to do with that." I says, "What's that mean?" He says, "Well, it means you're not going." So I go back. I think I had about another 3 weeks or so. It was a very long, what they call AIT. It's Advanced Training After Basic. It was much longer than some of the others because of the code that you had to learn. So I went back, and it turned out I didn't get the orders, and they allowed me to finish up the radio school. Then they sent me over to tank school to be a tank driver. Now, the reason I couldn't get the orders was that while I was in college, I was getting this weekly newspaper called the National Guardian. It was a real lefty newspaper. Do you remember it? And the National Guardian, and also I was also getting a monthly newsletter or whatever from China, which is Mao, China. And I'm not sure how much all this played into it. I was also in SDS, I was in all of these things. So every time I trained duty stations, the S2 officer, which is like the security guy, would come and interview me. And he would ask me about all this stuff and everything. Same thing every time. Just to touch base or whatever, I don't know what. But that was enough to keep me from getting the radio operator position because you needed a clearance. I couldn't even get the lowest level clearance of confidential. I could not get it. So they sent me to tank school, which was more like going back to basic training with these hard-ass drill sergeants who were total idiots. It was awful. But again, it was extra time. In the United States, spent doing this stuff. I said, every day I'm here, it's one day less I'd be spending over there. Actually, at that time, if you went to Vietnam, you only had to do one tour. One tour was 1 year. So it's not like this recent wars we've had where these soldiers get over there and then they reassign them back over there and they do 2 or 3 tours in Afghanistan or Iraq. So after I finished that, half my training class went to Vietnam, and I was in a lucky half. And I stayed at Fort Knox, moving tanks back and forth, pulling maintenance, doing that kind of stuff. Then the company I was in, the clerk was leaving, and they needed a company clerk. I was a college graduate, which I was older than most of the other guys I was serving with. A lot of these kids, they were kids, literally 17 years old, some of them. High school dropouts, because you didn't have to have a high school degree back then, from the backwoods of wherever. Poor guy, they didn't know anything. They didn't. And I was called Doc sometimes because I was like 4 years older than them, 5 years older, and I had a college degree. Anyhow, I could type, I could do all that stuff. So I ended up as a company clerk, which meant my uniforms didn't get dirty. I worked 5.5 days a week, had the weekends off, blah, 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 all that. By that time, my wife had come down. We had a young son. I was basically going to an office job every day there. After I was in, so that took me through 1970. The end of 70, I came down what they call a levy. And it basically is a list of names of people that they were going to send to Vietnam. So I've realized, well, if I get sent to Vietnam, I'm going to be there less than a year because I would get out in December of 71, and this was now January 71 by the time all this was taking place. And a couple of people got orders to go, and same thing, their orders were pulled and they never went. I never got orders, and I just stayed there. Then it was just dumb luck the whole time. It was just dumb luck. Then, towards the end of, or the middle of 71, there was a big reduction in force going on. I took my family back to New York for a 2-week leave. We drove back. We had a great time for 2 weeks. I get back to the base and find out that all the draftees were getting a 3-month early out. And if you had less than 3 months, you were getting out in 2 weeks or something like that. And I fell into that category. The next thing I know, I had about enough time to pack up, plan our move back to New York. So I was back home even before the date I would have normally gotten out of the Army. In fact, I got a job with the state of New York. I started the job with the state of New York right around the same date as I would have gotten out. So I was just dumb luck the whole time. Getting back to the activism part, while I was in there, I stayed connected with, actually there was a guy from the Progressive Labor Party. I knew some people in New York, and that's how they got connected, and he came to see me. I was getting the Guardian, I was getting all these other things. I would talk to people about what was going on, the other guys, and particularly these poor guys from, high school dropouts and things. When Kent State happened, I was in, it was May of '70, our company commander had a big gathering, like in a big auditorium at the whole company, and which he did regularly. And anyways, he said something about Kent State, and he's talked about it a little bit, and he says, "Well, so anybody have any thoughts about what happened?" I raised my hand. I stood up, and I said, "Well, these were college students. They were exercising their constitutional rights to protest. There's no reason to kill them. Even if somebody was throwing rocks, there's no reason to shoot them dead." I said, "It shouldn't have happened, blah, blah, blah." I did all that. I sat down. Well, he went up one side of me and down the other in his rebuttal. I have no idea what he said. But this young guy who was in my platoon, sitting next to me, one of these kids who, got the choice between going to jail or going in the Army, turned to me and he said, "I didn't know people could have ideas like that." That's why the Army likes people like that, After I got out of the Army, I wanted to have nothing to do with the military. I didn't join any veterans organizations. I didn't do anything like that. But on my job, interestingly enough, one of the guys in my training class was somebody I'd heard of in college, but never met, who was high up in the Progressive Labor Party. And that was a very, very left Maoist, I don't know, they weren't really Maoists, I don't think, but they were really hard left people. And sometimes on our lunch hour, he and I would go out and sell Challenge, which was their monthly newsletter on the streets and things like that. So I stayed in touch with things that were going on. Of course, that's around the time Nixon was getting elected. So I maintained some level of it, but I didn't become active with Veterans for Peace. I didn't know about it until I moved back to Albany. I moved back in '86. We bought a house in '87. And sometime after that, there was an article in the Times-Union about a proposal to have a monument to the victims of war, Vietnam War, in a park in Albany, which is there now. The victims were military people from Albany County who had been killed in Vietnam. Well, I said to myself, we're all victims of the war. So I wrote a letter to the Times-Union with that, saying, what about the Vietnamese? What about the people here? What about people who lost a son or a daughter due to the war? What about the people who went to Canada and destroyed their lives? Threw out all that stuff. And I get a phone call after the letter was published from a guy. His name is William Crapser. He was a writer. He wrote one of the best books in Vietnam I ever read. It was called Remains by William Crapser. And he said, "You know about this group called Veterans for Peace?" And I said, "No, sounds like I'm interested." So there was a local chapter in Albany, and I joined, and there were people in there. this is a sort of a theme with me in some ways. You know, you meet elders, you meet people who are doing things that you want to do, and so you follow them, you know. And one of the first people I met in Albany Veterans for Peace was Frank Hood, who's fortunately still with us. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was a colonel, pilot, flew air missions and stuff like that. And he was in Veterans for Peace. And once I joined that, I met all these wonderful men and women, because I met Ann Wright, who was a colonel who spoke out against the Iraq War later on. But I met all these wonderful people who, some of which were served in Vietnam, Green Berets, you know, people who had real combat experience, who really knew what was going on. And they didn't make me feel like, well, you didn't have combat. You're here working against the war. That's what we're all doing. That's what we're all doing together. And that's, I think one of your questions you're anticipating was the highlights of stuff. And one of my highlights was when the Iraq War started, was February, the first march against it in New York City was February of 2003, I believe. So I went down to New York City, like a lot of people, and I found the Veterans for Peace contingent, and there were, I don't know, maybe it was hundreds of us, I don't know. And there was these guys, and I just joined right in. And marching with us were what was left of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I think the last one just died recently, but there were a number of those guys then. They were probably in their 70s and 80s then. I can't do the math right now. But so proud to be marching, not only with these guys from Veterans for Peace, who really knew their shit and everything, but also with these heroes who fought fascism before World War II. And I was just thrilled and inspired, not just saying, oh, this is a big deal, but I was inspired to then, you know, carry on that kind of work. So, and I've continued that. So that's what I do. So this goes back to the beginning of our discussion about what inspired, or what inspires me. This is a poem I wrote about A.J. Muste, M-U-S-T-E, for anyone out there watching that doesn't know him. He was a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist, but I hate war. So, but A.J. Muste was a Presbyterian minister, pacifist. Believe he lived in Philadelphia. I'm not sure, but for a long time he camped out in front of the White House. This is in the 1950s, so it was like the anti-nuke stuff that was going on then. He was. I saw him in New York City. This is about seeing him at Union Square, and I dedicate this poem to Ed Block, who was one of my elders, one of the people that I remember fondly. Great friend, used to call me Dano. We had a common interest in the writing of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and Ed was a World War II Marine veteran, then became a union organizer and staunch member of Veterans for Peace. I've been on a couple marches in New York City with him. I just love the man dearly. He was spit on once, not by a protester, but by a construction worker during a march in New York City. And he said, I've never been spit on by any protesters. It's only those, and he's not against labor people. He was a labor organizer, you know. It's just these, whatever. So anyways, this is A.J. Muste for Ed Block. The title of this is A.J. Muste is dedicated to my friend Ed Block, who is no longer with us, but taught me a lot. It was in Union Square, New York City, mid-1960s. Still another anti-war rally. The concrete park filled with college students in denim jackets, jeans, work boots, ponytails, sandals, afros. We were young and angry and knew the war was wrong. On stage, folk singers, speakers, experts, they said the war was wrong. The line through Vietnam a fake. Soldiers were burning villages, rice paddies, children. We knew it was bad. We were angry, chanting. The man on the stage wore a three-piece suit, white shirt, a tie, clean-shaven, old. He said, "War is not an accident. It is the outcome of a way of life. If we want to attack war, we must attack that way of life." He said, "The problem is the victor thinks he has just proved war and violence win." He asked, "How do we teach the victor a lesson?" The man looked like my uncle, like someone going off to work on Wall Street, to a wedding, like someone from Washington we hated. The man said, "There is no way to peace. Peace is the way." I looked up at that man on stage. I said to myself, when I grow up, I want to be as cool as that old guy, that peacemaker in a three-piece suit. I had an uncle, lived over in Connecticut, and I go to his house, and he had a lot of poems committed to memory, mostly things like Longfellow, things from Shakespeare, soliloquies from Shakespeare and everything. And I just thought it was pretty cool. And up in the attic, I found those anthologies, great American or great English language poetry or whatever that. So I read that. And then I was writing little rhymey, clunkety-clunk things like that. And then, this is still in middle school. I hadn't gone to high school yet. At the Delmar Public Library, I discovered an anthology titled The Beat Generation and the Angry Young Men. And in there was a copy of Allen Ginsberg's Howl. And it just changed everything for me as to what poetry could be, how you could express yourself. I remember reading Howl to my friends, and they're like, oh, they couldn't believe it. It just changed. Maybe that changed my life, I think. But I would have found it anyway, someplace or another. But, God bless Delmar Public Library. Allen Ginsberg actually rode in my car. My friend Tom Nattell was very instrumental in getting him to Albany for the Writers Institute back in 1991, I believe. It was a year, in November. And Ginsberg agreed to do 2 benefit performances at the QE2 in Albany on Central Avenue for what was called the AIDS Council of Northeast New York at the time. And prior to that, he was doing a event for the Writers Institute at Page Hall, which was standing room only and everything. So Tom Nattell wanted me to drive Allen from Page Hall down to the QE2. Well, 5 minutes or something, whatever. So anyway, I was Allen's driver. So he introduced me to Allen at the thing. And so at the end, after Allen did his talk and everything, he came down. He was really not one of these stuck-up celebrities at all. I mean, he could sit here and regale us with stories and all that, He was that kind of a person. He loved ordinary people. He loved boys. But he was just a great, warm person. Anyways, so after he finished, he went down in front of the stage at Page Hall, and of course all these people were coming around. Ed Sanders was there, all these old buddies, people trying to get their book signed. It was like a homecoming kind of thing. And so I went up to him and I said, "Alan, I'm your driver." And he says, "Okay." He says, "Just tell me when you want me to leave." So I looked at my watch, figured out when we'd have to leave. Let him talk to all his friends. When it came time to leave, I tapped him on the shoulder and I said, "It's time to go." And off we went. No bullshit or anything. It was just what we did. So we get in the car, and I was also gave a ride. There was a reporter from the Metroland newspaper was going there, and so he asked for a ride down. And I said, all right. And so he sat in the back, and Alan sat in the passenger seat, and I'm driving. So as we're driving down there, I knew Alan had recorded musical versions of William Blake's poems, and particularly of Sunflower. And also the Fugs had also recorded a version of Sunflower. And so I said to Alan, I said, so when my kids were little, I said, I memorized some poems to say to them when they were going to sleep so I wouldn't have to put the lights on and everything. And I said, and I used to sing to them Sunflower. And he says, oh, how does your version go? So I sang my version, which was sort of a combination of Alan's and the Fugs.
Ah, sunflower, weary of time.
And then Alan said, well, I'll sing mine. So then he sang his version.
Sunflower, weary of time.
Meanwhile, my friend in the back seat, the reporter, he's going nuts. Afterwards, he tells me, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I'm in the car, Allen Ginsberg singing Sunflower. So we get down to the QE2, and he had 2 sold-out performances there. And again, afterwards, he's outside, people coming around. He was friendly with everybody. He had a ride from there on. I just had that one little thing. But I got some marvelous pictures of Alan, and I have marvelous pictures of him performing at the QE2. And actually, Tom Nattell ran an event called the Readings Against the End of the World. And it was a 24-hour thing every year. And I had some prints made of Alan's photo, the photo I took of Alan, to auction off as a fundraiser at the next one, which was held in April after that, November. And I called Alan's secretary, and I said, if I send copies down, I said, would he sign copies and then keep one for himself? So he did. He signed along the white border, and they sent him back. He kept the one, and we auctioned him off at the thing. So that's the kind of guy. And he was an activist. I mean, again, if we're talking about activism, Allen Ginsberg was an activist. He was against the war. He was against the drug wars that were going on. He was gay, so he was a supporter of the gay rights. And back in the 50s and 60s, when you don't talk about that stuff. So yeah, so he was an activist too. Another hero, another mentor. I first met Ruth Pelham through Tom Nattell and the Readings Against the End of the World. That was one of the things, when I came back to Albany, Readings Against the End of the World ran from, it was a once-a-year event for 24 hours, usually around Earth Day, usually around the weekend of Earth Day. And it started as a fundraiser for what was known as the Albany Peace and Energy Council, which was an anti-nuke group in Albany. The first one was held in 1984. I think I heard about it in 85, and I actually came up to Albany. I have family up here. I was living down in Yonkers with my family. I came up for the event. I had written to Tom. I'd read about it in some newsletter or whatever, and I was actually in the event in 1985. I think I had 15 minutes, and then I moved up in '86 for a job in Albany, and then I attended every year since then, up till '93, which was the last year that he did it. And it was not just readings; it was 24 hours of performance and things. And Ruth Pelham was a mainstay of that. They'd have a children's hour, and she would often do the children's hour. So. Yeah, she's another one of these long-time people who does her thing, has their little niche that she works on and everything. It's about the wider issues of social justice and stopping wars and healthy living and healthy environment and all that. But she does it with her music and her music mobile, which is legendary. And I live not too far from her. I go for walks sometimes around Buckingham Pond in Albany, and she's right off Buckingham Pond, and I see the van there. Grove Press publishes a book, and then through Veterans for Peace guys that I knew in Woodstock, I met Mary Frank, his wife. During the Iraq War, she made these wonderful cutouts. On one side was an American soldier holding another soldier. You turned it around. It was on a pole, and it was maybe it was from Afghanistan. Anyways, it was a woman in a burqa holding a child. Here's one that is sort of topical to the recent news about people leaving Afghanistan. And this is from a little chapbook that I published called Poeming the Prompt. What really happened was that it was nurses, doctors, civil engineers, and soldiers in clown suits who invaded Afghanistan in October 2001. The children laughed and thought that Americans were really funny and liked them. Their parents found work building roads and schools and water treatment plants. They even got TVs and small refrigerators, and the electricity stayed on all day and night too. What really happened was that when the dusty men from caves with Kalashnikovs told them Americans were evil and wanted to kill them, everybody laughed, and no one wanted to be a suicide bomber. How different things could be. Yeah. Over the years to now, I think their activism has stayed the same in many ways, in that it's people being concerned with an issue and taking to the streets, taking to the telephone, taking to their typewriter or pen. And let's remind ourselves that activism includes not only anti-war people, but pro-war people. That activism is also, I hate to say it, Proud Boys, and the anti-abortion people who, so, I think it's the duty of citizens, I think, to be activists and to come out and do what they have to do. Now in 2021, one of the biggest changes, of course, is the most obvious. Electronic media, emails. I can find out right away about things going on. Facebook, all of the stuff that's out there that people use. And of course, as time goes on, we folks become older, but the young people come up, and they're the ones who know how to use a lot of the media and stuff that I know how to use it. And a lot of, being old is not an excuse for not being able to know how to use the internet or the email. I'm sorry. If you're a smart person, you can do it. But kids who are growing up, I have grandchildren who, they already know how to operate these little machines and stuff. They understand it, and that's what they do. So they're using that, and they're using it very well. I get almost too much notices, emails, and stuff to be able to handle it all. But you filter it out. You know what to delete and what to keep. That to me is the biggest change, because we're always going to have demonstrations in the streets. We're always going to have that. We're always going to have some people want to destroy things. And or get carried away, because that's what youth do. We get excited and they want to, jump over a fence and go right out to the door of the mayor or whatever. That's just the enthusiasm of youth, and they've always done that. So we're always going to have the street demonstrations, and I'm a big proponent of these little vigils that we have. Speaking of that, another change really is that in the '60s. When I first came up with this, as being an activist, most of your events were in the big cities. New York, Chicago, San Francisco. We had all these big demonstrations in the cities. And our cities like Albany, our smaller cities, we had our demonstrations here too. But they generally were usually in more urban settings. A few years ago, I went down to Florida on vacation. And so I looked up on the internet, Veterans for Peace chapters down there, got a contact of a person. I was going to be staying in Clearwater. I found out that there was a weekly peace vigil in Clearwater. So, and I happened to be there at the time, and I went. Again, handful of people, 4 or 5 people like we would have, mostly older. There was one Veterans for Peace person there. It was sort of like if you're a Methodist and you go to another town and you want to go to church on a Sunday, you go to Methodist church, you go in there and you say, "Oh, hi, I'm Dan Wilcox from Albany, New York, and I go to the such and such Methodist church." And I say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And you do all that. Well, that's sort of like what you do at that. But what's happening, not just now, but it's probably starting with the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq war, is that lots of small towns have peace vigils, or had. There was more when everything was really hot. And again, it would be a half dozen people. Maybe the Quakers would be there. Maybe the Quakers, always the Quakers would be there. There's somebody from Veterans for Peace or whatever. But you could go anywhere in this country and find these vigils all over. And another thing is, in Albany at the time that I was talking about for the 60s and stuff, and these big demonstrations, the Social Justice Center didn't exist. That didn't come along until the late 70s, I believe, or whatever. But now you can go to any medium-sized city in the country, and there is some group, some actual building or storefront, like the Social Justice Center, which becomes a hub for whatever the issue of the day happens to be. And again, this is maybe the other change is that there are more issues that people are really organizing around. If you think about it, you had the Civil Rights Movement, you had the Vietnam War. What came in the meantime? In the 70s, we got the environmental issues, all right? And we have other social justice issues, such as mass incarceration and things. And so people's consciousness have been raised, I think, from this. And so while the 60s were a great a big fire of this activism, but it was in the biggest cities, now it's all over the country, everywhere you go. And it might be, water issues in some place as opposed to something else in another place. But it's everywhere. And that is a really good thing, because that's what we need to do. Everyone needs to be activists. We all need to be out there doing what. I'm not a big grand planner guy. I don't go to planning meetings. I don't like all this people, we should do this, we should do that. I just sit home and then they send me a notice, be here and be there, kind of thing. And I'm very happy to do that. I don't want to be the big cheese up front. I'm very happy to be there all the time. But what keeps me going is that I realize this is my life. I don't see stopping this. I don't see, other than health reasons and death, I don't see any reasons to do it. I don't say, "Oh, the wars are never going to end." I know wars are never going to end. But I don't want anyone to say, "Well, they might have if you hadn't been out there," that kind of thing. And recently, in the last few years, some of the little thrills I get of being out there on the street with my Veterans for Peace hat, my shirt, my peace flag, or the Veterans for Peace flag. I go to Del Mar every Monday for that. I've been doing that since I started. And there would be these SUVs we would drive through. And people are creatures of habit. So I'd see some of the same people at the same time, 5 to 6 every Monday. And there'd be a woman driving an SUV and have a couple kids in car seats in the back, And if I see the kids, I give them the peace sign and all that. And the window would go down, and these little hands would go up. And they'd say, "Peace!" And a mother one time stopped and said, referring to everyone that's out there, the half a dozen or a dozen of us that were there. You people give me hope. But to see the kids do that, they're learning something. Another mother, I sometimes, where I live in Albany, I'm near St. Peter's, and once a month I go out across the street from St. Peter's, a busy, busy intersection of New Scotland and Manning Boulevard, and in the afternoon with my flag. And I'm often just by myself, but I can cover a lot of ground with that flag. And one lady came by, and the window came down, a little kid stuck her hand out. And the woman said, I already drove by before, she said, but she wanted to come back around and see the Peace Man. So, I mean, if I needed motivation, that would be the motivation. But ultimately, my motivation is we have to do this. That's just what it is. That's who I am. That's why I write poetry. I'm not for political purposes, but because, well, I'm a poet. I'm a writer. So that's what you do, you know? So it's not a mission. It's not anything. I'm glad I found Veterans for Peace. It gives me a connection to a larger organization, nationwide, actually international now. So I'm going to continue doing this, and maybe I'll bring a chair out there sometime when I can. Because we used to do that for Pat Beadle and Sue Clark at the vigils in front of the Capitol when it got to the point where they couldn't stand for half hour, 45 minutes. We started bringing folding chairs for them so they would sit there. So I'll be doing the same thing. Just keep doing it. I mean, we need you. And let me say this, there are young people who show up in Del Mar. And one of the things, unfortunately, unfortunately, the yin and yang of all of this is, after the Black Lives Matter and all, we got a lot more young people out there involved with that. And because of the environmental movement. So if we're ever going to work on these issues, and racism is something we always have, but right now there is such force with these young people against racism, against white supremacists, that I can only see it getting better. And let's think about it. This is a whole lot different world than 1950. And I told my kids this, and they don't see it because they don't see the things that were happening then. I didn't see black and white drinking fountains because I lived in the Northeast, so I didn't see that. But they existed when I was a child. My kids went to Albany High. They had black friends. They had gay friends. They had the kind of people I knew nothing about or had no association with growing up and going to school. I didn't get to know people like that until I went to college. It's a generational shift. And I think often these changes, these big social changes, are generational shifts. Because it's unthinkable, if I tell my kids about the black and white drinking fountains or black and white swimming pools or black and white bathrooms, it's unthinkable. I mean, how could that be? So what we've done is we wiped this out of their brains. And that is good. And I mentioned earlier, talking about Ed Bloch, Teilhard de Chardin. He was a Jesuit theologian and simplifying his complex theories. But one of his main idea was that consciousness is also evolutionary. So he put in a religious context where that we were all growing up and we're all going to be eventually, we're going to be so, this consciousness of the divine, that's what we're going to have. But if you look around, that's what Ed would say to me sometimes when he sees something good that was happening. He says, Dano, Chardin. Or he called Teilhard, he called him. Dano, Teilhard. So that's, I have hope because of that, because of the young people coming along. And so my advice to them is just keep doing it. Just keep doing it with whatever you got. And I'll give you whatever help I can. But you got the energy now. Do it.